Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again to the 2019 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series hosted by the University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farm team. This is Zach Grant once again, your weekly moderator for this series. And today actually marks the 6th webinar, so that means we are well past the halfway mark. We only have 5 webinars remaining in the 2019 series. We really appreciate you joining us for these webinars, and we're going to do our best to begin and end within the space of this lunch hour. However, this is a tight time frame, so we're going to ask you to leave your questions to the chat box as usual. And if we go over the hour, remember this is being recorded, and we will send you the link afterwards if you need to hop off the call. This presentation is being recorded as a reminder, and I will email that link after the program concludes. We will also have the usual very short online evaluation, and we really appreciate your feedback as it helps us improve the program for future years. This week's presentation is from Lori George. Lori is my fellow local food system small farm educator housed in Bond, Clinton, Jefferson, Marion, and Washington counties. Lori has a master's and PhD degrees from Southern Illinois University in Ag Science. She's been with Extension since 2011, and her responsibilities include development and delivery of educational programs focused on food safety, local food production, marketing, and integrated pest management initiatives. Lori and I are also on a sub-team within the state that delivers the Produce Safety Alliance's FDA-recognized Produce Safety Rural Curriculum training. Today, however, she will be taking us through maximizing your production via succession and companion planning. And with that, I'll go ahead and have Lori take it away.
All right, thanks, Zach. So as he mentioned, we will be talking about succession and companion planting today. And some of the topics that we're going to cover, the first thing I'm going to talk about is succession plantings, a little bit of how to get that done, some of the things to start thinking about. And then the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about farmscaping, which is a unique term that I found while doing research for this project. And so the farmscaping areas that I'm going to be talking about are companion plantings, trap cropping, and cover crops and living mulches. So let's start off to define what succession planting is. So generally what it is, it's basically it consists of crop rotation and recycling of space using new crops, planting the same crop more than once during a growing season to ensure a consistent harvest. And when you're looking at some of this, with these succession plantings, the harvest is generally going to be extended throughout the season. So this is something you want to be able to have so you have product for your markets, wherever they may be. It's the ability to maintain a continuous supply of product. It helps to maximize the garden space so that you are constantly having production in your garden space rather than having some of that ground sit fallow. And it's also improves the quality and yield of the produce and try and optimize it. So you may have some plantings that have short maturity dates, such as radishes and lettuce, maybe some green onions and carrots, that can be worked well with succession planting. Some of the others, such as maybe sweet corn, broccoli, cabbage, maybe some of the squashes can also be used for succession plantings. So generally what we're talking about on succession plantings is following one crop with another, and there are several ways that this can be done. Maybe planting a different crop in the same spot with different times, such as the picture you see here with the peas that were planted after the lettuce was harvested. You can plant the same crop, a different spot in different times. As the picture shows here, you have some lettuce that's ready for harvest, plus others that are not quite ready or were just seeded or transplanted in. So this gives you a good continuous cropping throughout the season. The other thing is planting the same crop at the same spot, but have different maturity dates. And I gave the example of summer squash and spaghetti squash with different dates of maturity. And the nice thing about this one is being able to have that crop that has the same type of production needs. So being able to control the insects for both those crops at the same time. This also helps to promote a good succession within your farm itself. And as I mentioned before, it is essential for continuous harvesting of some of those crops that I mentioned earlier. So other principles of succession planting is being able to think about how you're going to plant. So if you're planting transplants, you may want to plant those at the same time as you're seeding the same crop. So by the time you're harvesting those rows of beets or whatever crop you're using, once you start harvesting them, the other ones are just about ready to harvest for a second picking on that. On something like that, you may want to do seeding every 1 to 2 weeks, and this is going to depend on the different crops that you have and the maturity rates on those crops. But you want to try and do that throughout the season. And also, when you start thinking about succession planting, you may want to incorporate some sort of season extension technologies, something like row covers or high tunnels, especially in crops that are going to be planted in the spring and the fall. So the spring, you may be able to get those crops in a little bit earlier if you use row crops or have them planted in high tunnels for maybe some fall extension. One of the main things you need to think about on succession planting is crop rotation. Okay, crop rotation is using techniques to avoid plantings of the same crops from the same family in the same area. So if you are using maybe potatoes, planting potatoes following tomatoes or eggplants, you may not want to do that because they are both in the Solanaceae, they are all in the Solanaceae family. And if you plant the same crop over and over, you're going to get a buildup of diseases. The same thing with families. You build the same families with the same crops of the same family, you're going to have a buildup of some diseases and insects associated with that. So you want to also avoid following some plants with other non-family plantings. So when you look at the Rosaceae family and the Solanaceae family as an example, they both have a susceptibility to verticidal wilt. So you may want to keep these different families separated when you do any type of succession planting. Okay, crop rotation also helps to help manage soil fertility. So if you're planting, we all know that legumes tend to add nitrogen into the soil. So if you have something like sweet corn that you want to plant a little bit later in the season, maybe having some legumes in the soil prior to planting the sweet corn, or if you're going to be using it as a living mulch or a cover crop, and we'll talk about those later, you may want to have that nitrogen credit in the soil because sweet corn tends to be a high nitrogen user. The Crop Rotation on Organic Farm book, it's a really good book on this if you're interested in learning more about crop rotations. This is from SARE, which is the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Group. So it's an excellent book if you want some more information on that. Okay, so one type of succession planting is called intercropping. And intercropping is when you're going to have maybe fast-growing crops such as lettuce with short maturity rates that are going to be planted between rows of the same bed of a slower crop such as brassica or cole crops. This tends to have that land in production all the time. You're able to harvest and still grow those two different types of crops. On this one, another example is the lettuce is going to be harvested before the brassica tends to mature, so you're getting both crops. Generally, you try and use different families if at all possible, again, because of the disease and insect buildup that may occur, but it also tends to help optimize the crop yield that you want for your crops. Other ways of intercropping, planting annuals together for the benefit of all, such as a three-citrus planting, if you're not familiar with that. This is where corn is going to be planted with beans, which is going to be planted with squash. And the idea behind this is that the beans are going to crawl up the support of the corn stalk, and you'll be able to have the beans and the corn together. And then the squash is going to be used as kind of a living mulch or covering the soil to help reduce the amount of germination of weed seeds that can occur on that. The problem with some of this intercropping, such as with the Three Sisters, is being able to harvest all three of those crops. So there are some concerns when doing some intercropping. So think about how it's going to work out, not only for the planting, but for the harvesting as well. Perennials such as basil and garlic planted with annuals also tend to work well as far as intercropping. There are some antagonistic crops that we'll talk about a little bit later, and we'll touch on that, but you need to stop and think that if you're going to use any type of cover crops, intercropping, succession planting, to be aware of whether this crop is going to work well with your cash crop. Okay, and the big difference between intercropping and crop rotation is that intercropping, you're planting different plants at the same space at the same time, whereas crop rotation, it's going to be different times that you're going to be planting those. So there's a big difference between those two. So a very good article I found from Kara Roswell from the Northeast Organic Farming Association on crop planning for intensive market gardens. It was a very good article associated with being able to do succession plantings. In it, she interviewed a grower on how he manages to grow $80,000 on a single acre. So that's $80,000 of crops on a single acre. He stated that it was important to create a crop plan. And so I'm going to touch a little bit on the crop plan that he was talking about, giving you some ideas and things to think about. But generally, the plan is going to cover anything and everything that has to do with crop production for the farm. So creating a crop plan, it helps you stay on track and ensures that you are getting the maximum returns for the crops that you're planting on the acreage that you have it planted on. So it assists in knowing what to plant and when. For this, you really need to know the earliest and latest suggesting planting dates of your crop for your specific area. The other thing to think about is whether you're going to have direct seeded plants versus transplants. So growing your own transplants, the plan should differentiate between growing transplants in a greenhouse environment, like when to seed them, and direct seeding into the ground. Greenhouse plantings should have their own planting schedules. From voice of experience in working with greenhouses, make sure you incorporate seedling and field losses. Maybe plant 10 to 15% more seeds, or have 10% more transplants that are needed to help cover any type of losses you may have from disease or insects. Working forward from the planting date is another way of developing your crop plan. Crops like leafy greens or lettuce, spinach, sweet corn, and beans, you may want to plant every 7 to 10 days. If you have crops like beets or arugula, maybe turnips, plant them every 14 to 21 days. Other crops may require 21 to 30 days, such as cucumbers or squash. So it's all going to depend on the maturity dates of your specific crop. When working backward from the harvest date, if you know that a crop is needed by a specific date, such as sales to restaurants or retail stores, or maybe you're a CSA and you need a specific crop by a specific date for a specific customer, then you can start working backward from the harvest date. But if you do this, make sure that you give yourself a few leeway days in case of crop failure or weather concerns. Creating a crop plan, other thing you need to think about is how long can the crop be harvested? Is it a cool season versus a warm season crop? Cool season crops can be planted in the spring and again in the fall when the warm season crops start to peter out. Is the soil workable in your area? You need to know your frost-free dates for your area, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. One of the main things with the crop plan is, can your soil handle the continuous cropping? So growing additional crops in the same space will remove more nutrients from the soil over just one season. So consider incorporating crop rotations in the cover crops, maybe compost amendments, green manures, some grasses or clovers in your planting schedule to help keep that soil productive and maintain good soil health microorganisms. You may have a piece of land out of production by using some of these techniques, but in the long run, it's going to be worth it. So when you're talking about your markets, what is your market? Are you a CSA? Are you selling at a farmer's market? Are you going to retail or wholesale agencies? When will you need the product? This all goes back to the previous point on knowing what to plant and when. As I mentioned before, if you have a CSA business and you have shareholders that are looking for boxes each week, make sure your production schedule is lined up with when the product is needed. And this is going to be really important. Where will you store the product and how long will you be able to store it? If you're growing a crop that may require storage, such as maybe peaches or apples, where will you store it? How long will you be able to hold that product before it starts to go bad? Do you have a cooler that you can put it in? Where is that going to go? Does the crop have a short maturity date, such as lettuce, radishes, beans, peas, depending on the variety, in which case you have to harvest the crop and replant a new one during the growing season. So will it produce all season long? It's going to depend on the variety that you have. Knowing how much to plant will fall into the financial planning aspects of your farm. This is where that seesaw is at. So you have to regulate what you're growing as far as what the profit is that you're making on it. Too little product results in lost revenue. Too much product is also a loss of revenue, but you put more into the loss of revenue from when you grow too much because you got water and pesticides, labor, all associated with that. So working in a greenhouse environment, I used a formula to determine how many plants I could grow on a specific bench and when the crop would be ready to be moved outside. And then I figured a replanting schedule for my next crop. There are several good calculators that can be found online just by putting in crop calculators. But if you're interested, there are a couple of them here on Penn State University. They have a crop planning publication that works well and shows you how to figure based on the amount of land or bench space that you have. Another one is called Veggie Compass, and this is a whole farm profit margin program that you can access. And the Small Farms Local Foods team did do a webinar a couple of years ago on Veggie Compass record-keeping software. And I also put a link into the webinar that you can go to learn more about how to develop these crop plans as far as figuring yield calculations. Another good one that I found was some Johnny Selected Seeds. And if you haven't seen this, they have a calculator that you can put in all the information as far as the type of crop that you want, what are the interval days that you're looking for, and then it will help you to figure out the first, second, third, and additional types of plantings. So this is another one that I wanted to give you as a resource that you can go to help you to determine on succession plantings. So when we talked a little bit earlier about knowing when to plant and whether it's cool season, warm season, knowing your frost-free dates for your area is going to be really important. So the first spring planting and the first frost date, make sure you understand what those dates are, what you're looking at for your area. You need to adjust your planting accordingly based on the crop variety itself. I do have a couple of websites that I wanted you to be familiar with. This one is from the NOAA website, and it gives you the freeze and frost occurrence dates in Illinois. It will specifically tell you where the station is, the NOAA station. This is probably about 5, 6, 7 pages long, and there are many, many different areas throughout Illinois that record these, but it also gives you the spring date and the fall date probability levels of reaching either 36 degrees, 32, or 28 degrees. And it gives you the dates that you can start working on for the area that you live in. Second one I wanted to reach out and show you was the Illinois frost dates and growing season. And this is from the state climatologist website. Again, it's going to tell you the threshold temperatures of 32 and 28. It will also give you a map so you can locate where you're at on the map. And it will also give you dates, spring dates and fall dates for the growing seasons and the season lengths based on those maps. So it's a little bit easier to look at. May not have as much information, but it's a good resource to go to. So record keeping is probably the most important item a grower should do in creating a crop plan, not only to know what your yields were from the previous years to help plan for the current and future years, but also knowing the production quality of each of the different varieties that are grown on your farm. Know where you planted what, keeping in mind crop rotation for the next season. Keep detailed records of costs of production, crop yields, and sales to customers. Don't forget your greenhouse planting schedules, your dates and varieties, etc. Knowing this information will also help with financial expectations of the farm, and it will also help you to develop some realistic goals. Okay. The record keeping generally goes back to the yield calculations information presented earlier, such as working with the spreadsheets, ordering seeds, planting schedules, things like that. So it's important to become familiar with succession planting, like what to plant and where, and incorporating your cash crops with other plantings to maintain a consistent supply all season long. But a term that I became familiar with while doing my research for this presentation was farmscaping. And Jeff Zender from Clemson University has an article from extension.org on making use of nature's pest management services. So in it, he generally says that a whole farm ecological approach to increase and manage biodiversity with the goal of increasing the presence of beneficial organisms. And he termed this as farmscaping. So farmscaping provides several things. Okay. It provides food and shelter for beneficial organisms, planting specific plants to help bring in the predators of harmful insects in the garden area by providing food and cover. It helps to suppress weeds without reducing the quality. It uses the pollinators that provide nectar and pollen for the predators, such as the good bugs that you want to bring into the garden, by establishing cover crops and having a water source on the farm to help bring in and maintain these good bugs. And by incorporating all of this on the farm, you'll be able to start to establish a wide variety of species, such as insects and plants, that will begin the process of developing a proper functioning agroecosystem. So let's talk a little bit about farmscaping. And in this, I'm going to break it into three areas. We're going to talk a little bit about companion planting, trap cropping, and cover crops and living mulches. So part of the group of strategies in agroecosystems, such as what we're going to be talking about on succession and planting and trap crops. Generally, the addition of specific plants in an area to enhance the growth and quality of nearby crops are what we try and establish with companion plantings. And they're generally used to deter or repel pests. What you want to try and do is create a polyculture or a multiple of plantings of different types of plants when you do any type of companion plantings. With the polycultures, it's harder for the specialized herbivores or those that whose only crop they attack is maybe one or two different varieties, as opposed to generalist herbivores that attack anything. So it may be harder for the specialized herbivores to find their host plants. These insects generally use visual and scent to find them. Companion plantings also give you a broader base of plants for natural enemies to exploit as far as pollen and nectar. So beneficial relationships have been found. So when we start looking at some of the information that's out there, it's kind of a generalistic thing. And when I started working with companion plantings, I found that some resources that I used said that this was good with a companion planting with this crop. And then another book I went to was, this doesn't work for this crop. And so that's what kind of geared me toward doing a little bit more in-depth research on some of this. So some of the general books, like the garden publications, things like that they have out there, bee-friendly plants that you have in the garden that you can use as companion plants would be like the calendula, marigolds, clover, sturgeon, these type of plants. So generally marigolds that have problems with aphids and green flies. Some of those plants would benefit with having a planting of marigolds associated with it. The nasturtium attracts caterpillars, aphids, and whiteflies. So this is a really good trap crop, and we'll talk about those in a minute, about what you can incorporate on your farm as well. Another one is borage, and if you're not familiar with borage, it's a pretty little blue flowered plant, but it is a storehouse of minerals, and it does attract quite a few beneficial pollinators and parasitic wasps, and that's going to be important if you plant things like tomatoes for the hornworm and things like that. So you want to be able to have some sort of companion planting that's going to go well with that. Lovage, parsley, basil, and companion plantings with multiple type of plants such as basil, parsley, marigolds, and nasturtium go well with a lot of companion plantings within your vegetable gardens. Beneficial insects, you want to be able to bring them in, so feeding on nectar and pollen. So it's going to be important that you bring in some of the flowers that have these rewards for them to come into the garden. Dill, sweet basil, thyme, cilantro, and sage. Now these are the ones that are going to have a little bit more stronger scent associated with it. So the sage is going to plant around cabbage and carrots. Helps keep it away from cucumbers. So there's pros and cons on all of these. The hyssop and the thyme are all that you can use in the vegetable garden to help bring in some of those beneficial insects. So when plants get attacked by insects, they generally protect themselves by initiating a defense mechanism of volatile substances. And these substances tend to repel some of the pests by interfering with how the insects locate them, how they feed, and the distribution and mating systems of some of the insects. But unfortunately, by developing these mechanisms, they also can attract fortunately, they can attract natural predators over long distances as well. So things like marigold. Marigold releases a thipine, which is a nematode repellent, but it's also a good companion plant to be planted for other reasons, as we mentioned. Some of the other companion plantings you may be familiar with are pyrethrum from the pyrethrum daisy, neem or neem products that you can use from the Indian neem tree, herbs, rosemary, basil, mint. These are all strongly scented type of plants that will help deter some of those predators. Onions, mustard greens. There's a lot in research as far as that being a biofumigant if you're having problems with some of the diseases within the soil itself. So insects use visual stimuli to find host plants as well, not just scents. So the plant size, the shape, and the color all are dependent on you doing companion plantings to bring these bugs in. Some good examples that I have here is the broccoli planted with the marigold. Again, when you're doing type of companion plantings, you don't want the companion plant to grow larger than the cash crop because it'll reduce some of the light and nutrients and water mixes that may come in there. So that's one thing you need to think about. Here's another example of some cole crops planted with onions. And the last one is if you're a really small grower, you can just plant the marigolds directly around a tomato plant, as you see here, and being able to try and fight off some of those insects as well. So we found that there are beneficial relationships in companion plantings, but not all the studies I found using repelling companion plants had positive results. Okay. So a study that was done by Lathif and Irwin in 1979, they were looking at imported cabbage worm, the diamondback moth, the loper, the webworm, using perimeter plantings with 15-foot distances between those plantings. They found that there was really no significant difference between the treatments and the control for the pests themselves. When another study using French marigolds intercropped with carrots, this one was in a mixed cropping of carrots with onions, and it found that it reduced attacked by carrot fly on carrots and thrips on some onions compared with the monoculture. So having a polyculture or more than one type of planting on this using different plants worked better. Increasing plant density also reduced the numbers of carrot aphid beetles. So carrots did well with young onions, but it was ineffective when the onions were bulbing. So again, they did a time study on this and found that as the onions got older, they didn't do as well of a job. And the last one I found that kind of just as an example is the Brussels sprouts intercropped with sage and thyme. Okay, so this was working on the diamondback moth oviposition. So they were looking at the eggs that were deposited by the diamondback moth. This was a greenhouse experiment. And it was an intercropping of sage and thyme, which showed reduction of egg laying on Brussels sprouts. The intercrop of white clover versus the intercrop with the thyme, they had lower egg laying loads on brassica associated with clover over that of thyme. So one worked better than the other. So they postulated that it was probably an olfactory effect that may account for the difference. So being able to use these companion plantings is going to make a difference as to how it's going to affect your cash crop itself. So we talked about a little bit on antagonistic crops. So there are some crops that you can use as companion plantings and others that you can't, depending on what your cash crop is. So things like white garlic and onions tend to repel pests and make good neighbors for most gardens, but beans and peas don't do well around them. Radishes also attract leaf miners, which don't harm the radish bulbs, but if you have spinach next to it, another cool season crop, you may have a problem with it. And again, onions with beans or peas is a bad combination as they tend to stunt their growth on that. Other things such as fennel and carrots, kale, melons, and potatoes. There's all sorts of crops that you should not do, and there's a lot of good publications out there that you can go to as far as companion planting, such as you see here. So I knew that there was going to be some questions as far as where do I find some of this information, so I did give you some resources that you could go to. Carrots Love Tomato is a really good book. I've used that in the past on some other talks that I've had. Gives some basic information as far as what are some good crops and what are some of the bad crops themselves. Companion planting from Mother Earth News, they had a very good article associated with that. Todd Weinman from the North Dakota State University on companion planting chart. This was an excellent one because it was a chart. I was able to look through it and find out specific datings and times associated with that. Cornell University has an excellent one, and there's an article called Companion Planting and Insect Pest Control, which also gives some really good information and additional resources for you to look at for companion plantings. So overall, companion plantings tended to work well, but the big thing about this is that you really kind of need to do your research to make sure that your cash crop is the one that you are going to harvest, and that the companion plantings that you're using next to it are going to work rather than reduce yields. So let's talk a little bit about trap cropping. And some of the trap cropping that I have, I put this under conventional trap cropping. Is generally what you're trying to do is with a trap crop, is to lure the insect pest away from your cash crop. And Hoken back in 1991 did studies on this, and he found that if you do about approximately 10% of the main crop area into trap cropping, you'll have a reduced amount of bad pests coming in, and it's going to depend on how many pests you expect. So if you grow a large cropping of cash crop, you may want to have a little bit larger area of trap cropping, depending on how many pests you expect and what type of pests you need. So trap cropping is also planted or transplanted before the cash crop. You want it available for those insects when they start coming in before your cash crop is developing the fruits of your labor on that. So you want it to provide food source for the pests while you're doing that. Okay. So the trap crop must be more attractive to the pest than the cash crop itself. And for this, you may need some multiple plantings on it. So diversity makes for a more attractive crop. Make sure that you offer different plants that have chemical profiles such as volatiles, or maybe something that's going to be a physical structure such as a height or color or patterns that's going to be part of your trap cropping in order to do that. So the control of the pests in the area is going to be essential. So when you're doing a trap crop, there is a potential for more insects to go into the trap crop. But if that trap crop is full, then they will spill over into your cash crop. So you really need to start trying to control the trap crop before those insects become too abundant. So to do this, you can do several things. You can use insecticides within the trap crop to kill those insects prior to them going into the cash crop. You can grow the trap crop and then till it under. When you find that it's no longer being beneficial, go ahead and till it under, but make sure that you have another one available if at all possible. If you're into any type of organic production, you may want to just destroy the trap crop. You may want to spray it. If it's no good, then go ahead and remove it and then do any other type of trap crop or a different trap crop if at all possible, if you have time during the season. One of the different trap crop species can be released. They can release different types of compounds. So depending on the trap crop that you're using, such as a study here by Parker in 2012, they did monocropping versus polycrops of trap crops to control the crucifer flea beetle and broccoli. And so they were trying to take a look and find out if the monocrop did better or whether a polycrop did. And what they found was that out of the 5 that they did, the planting of these 3, the Pacific gold mustard, the choy, and the rape seeds, the diverse trap cropping protected broccoli more successfully than planted alone or in polycultures of just the 2 species. So sometimes having 2 or 3 different types of trap crops out there is going to be more beneficial, and you'll get higher yields from that based on some of the research that I found. So the trap cropping, it's best if it's more appealing to the pests over your cash crop. So take a look and see what's available and what you want to do for that. Works best for pests that have greater mobility. Those are the strong flyers over those that don't travel distances. So those bugs that come in on the wind may not do well with trap cropping. They may just blow into your trap crop if you have a perimeter around there. Some of the stronger flyers that go over the trap crop and land directly into your field, those are the ones you need to start thinking about as well. So the trap crop is beneficial if it's easily planted and maintained. So you don't want something that you're going to have to spend a lot of time with, but it's also beneficial if your trap crop could also become a cash crop, such as sunflowers. Everybody loves sunflowers at the farmers markets. And they also said that spatial dimensions between the trap crop and the cash crop can be important. So if you're doing a perimeter trapping crops where it's going to be a trap crop surrounding your cash crop, you may want to have that about 8 to 12 foot away from the cash crop. In order to be able to control for that, you don't want them to be able to make it easy for them to go from the trap crop onto your cash crop. So having some sort of a distance between those 2 may be beneficial. So this is just one example of setting up a trap crop as far as a perimeter planting, depending on the size of the land that you have. Another example is having the trap crop either as a perimeter planting on the right or doing a trap cropping that's going to take care of 2 different types of cash crops that you want to keep separate. And here's just a third one as far as if you have multiple plantings on your land and you want to have different types of trap crops that set it up. This is another excellent way of being able to present this on your fields. This is an interesting one that I found. It's called dead-end trap cropping. And this is where plants that are highly attractive to insects, but where the offspring are unable to survive. So this information comes from Shelton and Nault and from Badens and Perez, where they did research, and basically they were doing dead-end traffic cropping to see about improving the management of the diamondback moth on some of the crops that they have. So using plant chemistry and insect preference to study the potential of brassica as the dead-end crop for that diamondback moth. And what they found was that they used yellow rocket as the plant that for that trap crop for that plant. The adults like this plant because they like to be able to lay their eggs on it, but the offspring don't survive on the plant. Hence the name dead-end trap cropping. So it makes it really easy for them to try and control some of this diamondback moth. So these can be planted as field borders to help intercept these insects before they reach your cash crop. Another type of trap cropping is called genetically engineered trap cropping. This study that I found was from Hoy, who did Colorado potato beetle resistant management strategies using transgenic potatoes. And what they did was they used these BT crops, potato crops, and they set them out as a trap crop to help manage these potato beetles. So they used it as a perimeter trap crop outside of the field of where they planted their regular potatoes, which was their actual cash crop. So they planted them early around the perimeter, and it surrounded that non-BT crop. They found that they had better control of the Colorado potato beetle when they used them as the trap crop for those. Collards is another type of genetically engineered trap crop that has been looked at in 2003 and 2005. And this was helped to manage some of the Lepidoptera or some of the moths that come into the fields that attack some of the collards or some of the cole crops as well. And they found that there are some plants that can be used as such. The nice things with these BT crops is that they can become effective in helping to control some insect vectored pathogens. So if you have some insects that are feeding on these BT crops, then the BT gets into their system, and it's going to help control some of these vectors if they go from the BT crop over to a non-BT to be able to stop progression of these viruses or anything else that they carry. A couple of research areas that I found and I thought would be beneficial would be, these are demonstration projects that have implemented trap cropping systems to help attract insect pests in ornamental and food crops. So it's not only just here in the United States, but it's all over the world. And I thought this would be interesting because if you're interested, if you have a crop that you're trying to grow, such as cucumber, the trap crop that you want to try and use is like butternut squash. But in the United States, it tells you what type of implementation, whether it was in a field or greenhouse or a laboratory where the research took place, as well as the reference. And in the back of the paper, it'll give you all the information you need to look it up. But it gives the name of the person that did the research. So this is a really good one if you have specific crops that you want to look up for any type of research that's been done in the past as far as trap cropping. And this one was just released back in 2018. It's called Application of Trap Cropping as Companion Plants for Management of Ag Pests. Another research paper I found, this was for biological parameters of herbivores that are influenced by diversification of crucifer crops. So this is going to show an impact of the diversification on the types of insects that attack these crops. And again, it's going to tell you the type of crop, the type of companion plant that they used, what insect species they were trying to control them, where the study was done, and who the author was for those papers. This was done in 2003, but it still has some really good information for you to start using as a resource. When we start looking at companion plantings and trap cropping, you need to start thinking about the good bugs versus the bad bugs. Who's coming into your fields? So these farmscaping techniques, using them, it's going to be dependent on knowing what pests need to be controlled based on your cash crops. Being able to know who they are, where they're coming from, what time of the season do you expect them to start coming from. So any type of monitoring systems that you can use sticky traps, any type of insect traps, whatever's going to be work best for you, you need to be able to identify them correctly. And then knowing what's coming in, being able to plant as companion plants what to plant in order to bring their predators in. So such as this nice little tomato hornworm that we have here with the little parasitic eggs that are attached to him. You know, things being able to bring in the assassin bug or the parasitic wasp to be able to control these is going to be important. So knowing what's coming in and what plants you can use is going to be important for maintaining a good yield on your cash crop. The other thing is knowing the difference between the two. So one of these is a Mexican bean beetle and one of them is a lady beetle. If you can't tell the difference between them, you may be trying to control the wrong type of pest. So make sure that you understand the differences between them. If you find something, make sure identification is complete and that you try and control specifically for that pest if at all possible. Okay, cover crops and living mulches. Let's talk a little bit about them. When we start looking at cover crops, the definition would be any living ground cover that can be planted into or after the main crop. And generally when we do cover crops, we do any type of cereal grains such as rye, oats, things like that, or legumes such as clovers or alfalfa or something that may have a beneficial or have a pod associated with it. So the cereal grains tend to reduce the leaching of the nitrates and other nutrients, and the legumes generally add organic matter and tend to add nitrogen into the soil. With cover crops, what you want to be able to do is to go ahead and plant them, and then you're going to cut them down and destroy them before planting of the subsequent crops. You want to be able to do this so that it doesn't really compete a lot with your cash crop as far as sunlight, water, nutrients, organic matter, fertilizers, anything that you add in there. Cover crops tend to reduce soil erosion. They're really good at reducing weed pressure. They are good at increasing the soil organic matter, helps to increase water infiltration within the soil itself. So there are some really good reasons to develop cover crops on your land. Okay. The other thing with cover crops is that you will lose less water runoff. The loss of nutrients and pesticides are almost totally eliminated, according to Hall when he did a study in 1984. They were really looking at the cyazine losses in runoff from non-tillage corn and using living mulch and dead mulches versus unmulched conventional tillage. So they found that the water runoff was reduced quite a bit using cover crops. Living mulches and green mulches. So living mulches are crops that are planted before or with a main crop. And these are going to be maintained as a ground cover during the growing season, hence the name living mulch. They're going to be reseeded for subsequent years depending on the crop that you're using. Things like clover can reseed itself year after year, so you may not need to have additional seedings of it. So it depends on the type of cover or living mulch that you're going to be using. Green manures are generally going to be called the same as living mulch because when you plow, if you decide to plow these living mulches in, they're still green. They're still adding a lot of nitrogen, a lot of nutrients back into the soil as they tend to decay. A couple of studies that were done by DeGregorio and Ashley. First one was white clover as a living mulch with sweet corn and snap beans for weed control, and they found that the clover did an excellent job of trying to reduce those weed controls, had some very good yields associated with some of the crops that they grew. Second study was using winter rye, ryegrass, and subterranean clover, and found that some of these crops that they used were allelopathic, and which meant that they helped to reduce or suppress or control some of those weeds by giving off some compounds as the root system started to degrade. So allelopathic means that it's going to help to try and kill those seeds before they even start to germinate. Some really good studies done by them. So when you're thinking about cover crops or living mulches, there are certain things you need to start thinking about as how you're going to incorporate them into your plantings or with your cash crops. First, you want something that's going to have quick emergence and fast soil coverage. So you don't want something that's going to take forever to start growing. You want something that's going to be there to cover that soil surface so that those weed seeds cannot germinate. You want to be able to have it short in height. If you have a cover crop or a living mulch that tends to overtower your cash crop, it's going to take a lot away from the sunlight, and the amount of yields that you may get from that crop can be reduced. You want them to bring in natural enemies of the damaging insects, and we mentioned that because you need to be able to know what insects are coming in, what type of plants or cover crops and mulches you want to plant in order to try and reduce those populations. Are you going to use those cover crops and mulches to promote nitrogen availability? So you want something that's going to be able to do that, such as hairy vetch, maybe some of the clovers that are out there. You want it low maintenance, and you want low water requirements. You don't want to have to spend a lot of time taking care of these cover crops. That's not why you're doing it. You need to spend all of your time on your cash crops so you can get the best yields and the best revenue possible from your plantings. If you're going to use grass species, you want something that's going to be non-spreading, maybe a bunch type of a grass or a tillering type. Tillering means it's going to grow, the daughter plants are going to grow from the crown of that main plant. You want them grown early with high density and a low growth habit on those. Research has also found that using cover plants with certain crops, such as pepper and tomato, broccoli, sweet corn, all can have yields comparable or even higher than in conventional cultivation. So I put some of the resources in the back. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can be able to access these resources and find out exactly what they did and how they did it and what crops they used it on. But there was a definite yield comparison with an increase when using these cover crops and living mulches. Now, as with companion planting, there are some concerns using cover plants. If you're using the small grain crops, they may have a cash crop yield reduction. From a study that was done by Brainerd in 2004 and 2012, they were using irrigated broccoli and non-irrigated asparagus. They used cereal rye as the living mulch, and they found that the reduction in weed germination during the first year, but also had a reduction in soil moisture. So the first year they had less weeds, but they also had a reduction in the moisture of the soil, which could have developed into smaller yields for the cash crop. But in subsequent second and third years, they had higher densities of summer annual weeds, including amaranth and sandbur, during the fern growth of the asparagus over the herbicide treatments. When they looked at the broccoli trials, they found that they were between the no treatment, the hairy vetch, lana vetch, and oats planted into cabbage production. If it was interseeded early, like 10 days after transplant of the cash crop, they found that all of the species significantly reduced cabbage yields. However, when they went out to 20 to 30 days after transplants, the vetches could be sown without a yield penalty for the cash crop. And they found when they used the oats that they were competitive even when sown even 30 days after the transplant of the cash crop. So again, it's going to depend on the type of cover crop or living mulch that you want to do to find out what best works for what you want to do. So overall, the cover crops and living mulches are really beneficial for the biological activity of the soil. So review the research, find out what's out there before you make some final decisions on what you want to do. A really good paper that I found when doing this was put out in 2013, and it's called Living Mulches in Vegetable Crop Production. And these are perspectives and limitations. And this is a review paper, which means that the authors here took all the different types of research that was available to them running from 1980s all the way up to 2012 or so, and put it into a review paper into what worked, what didn't, what areas, if it's a cold crop, if it's a Solanaceae crop, and how it worked for each of the researches. So it's a really good paper, again, for a resource if you are looking to learn more about this. Another good website that we have is called the Midwest Cover Crops Council. And if you're not familiar with it, I did put the website up there. It's mccc.msu.edu. In this, you'll be able to go directly in there. You can, as you see from the top, it has selector tools and the species, what state you live in. So you can specify living in Illinois. You can specify what you want to do with that, if you want to add nitrogen or have a nitrogen source for the crops. If you want to use grasses or use a cover crop that needs to be killed prior to planting of spring. This website is a really good one to start learning on. You give it all the parameters that you have for your farm, and it will spit out the type of cover crops that will work best for what you want to do. Excellent, excellent website. So in summary, when we start looking at the cover crops and the diversification of plantings that you want to do, the diversification is important to bring in the natural predators of the damaging insects, and it should really be a part of your IPM mix. So anything that you're doing on the farm, try and incorporate some of these into what you're currently doing. Be cautious when incorporating companion plantings such as the trap cropping, the cover crops, or the living mulch into your crop rotations, as some of the results are going to be mixed. Use the information you gather as a guide and modify it as needed. And that's going to go back to your record keeping, making sure that you keep those records. If this is what you planted this year, this is the results that you had from the yields of that year. Maybe you may not want to incorporate that again. So each farm is going to be different. Each farm has different soils, water availability, climate, and crops. Anything that has to do with your farm, it's a lot different than your farm up the road. So keep an eye on your soil health. Make sure that you keep that healthy. Next week, I believe James Thury is giving a really good talk on healthy soil produces healthy vegetables. Excellent one to get some information as far as keeping your soils healthy. But it's really important that you do that, especially if you're incorporating some of these succession and companion plantings. Making sure that it's going to work for your farm. And again, make sure you keep your record keeping, as I mentioned earlier. Some of the resources that are available, I know it seems like a lot of them, there are, but there's some really good ones I put in there just so you have those resources in case you were looking for them. And with that, I think I am done, Zach.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lori. There were no questions put in the chat box. I just sort of queued up our participants. If they had any questions, they can go ahead and enter them in. We still do have a few more minutes, so if there are any pertinent questions that you want to ask while we're on the line, feel free to do so. Maybe you did such a good job giving a summary overview that, that nobody has any questions.
If they don't have access to the PowerPoint presentation, they should, because I believe you sent out a copy in a PDF form.
Yep.
But if for some reason you don't, feel free to email me, and I will be very happy to send the references out to you so you can start looking at some of the resources that are available to you.
Great.
Yeah. A lot of information, and I know that, and that's why I wanted to include the resources so they had them.
So I did send out the PDF, so everyone should have that. And if anyone didn't get it, I will gladly submit that back. And yeah, so if there aren't any questions, I want to thank Lori. That was an excellent overview. I think you covered quite a bit. You packed a lot in that 1 hour period. I think you highlighted some potential options that might work, but also I appreciated the cautious optimism when incorporating some of these things into your systems. It'll be interesting to follow future research surrounding this, because I think there's a real lack of applied research around some of these things you brought up. So with that, I want to thank Lori and thank everyone for participating today, and be on the lookout for the linked webinar on our YouTube channel, as well as a short evaluation for this webinar that we always appreciate your feedback on. So hopefully you all have a great 2019, and we'll see you in the next coming weeks to finish off the webinar series. So thank you, and have an excellent day.